let's go to our guest, Steve Swerdlow, a human rights expert and associate professor at University of Southern California, or USC, and he joins us from Los Angeles. Steve, really historic scenes unfolding at the White House. I've been in this business many years, and I don't ever remember a time that all these European leaders, along with the president of Ukraine, converging in the White House with a simple goal to end the crisis, to end this conflict in Ukraine. What is your takeaway?
Well, Asieh, it's great to be with you. I think I agree with you fully that it's been a flurry of diplomatic activity, and President Trump is certainly to be commended for restoring some momentum to this process. But I think the fundamental concerns that I have and that other supporters of Ukraine and observers of the situation have is that Russia not be rewarded for its initial invasion, for its active aggression, which began in February 2022 and also even earlier in 2014. And that remains the question, is whether or not Putin has persuaded President Trump to really give him something in exchange for nothing, which is that this began with Russia's act of aggression and invasion. And now I think many are still concerned that if Ukraine is not given the appropriate security guarantees and the proper incentives are not there for Russia to stop its aggression, then you will see this setting a precedent that is very dangerous, not just for Ukraine, not just for Europe, but for the world, in total. We'll have might makes right as the new principle of international relations, something I think no one wants to see.
I thought it was interesting that Germany's chancellor really made a point, along with French President Macron, to talk about the need for ceasefire. We've seen a shift from Donald Trump since that Alaska summit on Friday. Trump seems to have moved away from a ceasefire to pushing for a full peace deal. Talk to us about the difference here and why that ceasefire is a priority for the European leaders.
You know, Asieh, I was in Ukraine all of June, and nightly I was down in the bomb shelter. I was a visiting professor there, and I was experiencing the terror that Ukrainian civilians experience every day and have for the last 3 years. And that's why a ceasefire is so essential. What Putin would show by doing a ceasefire is a show of good faith. He'd show something that he hasn't shown heretofore, which is a willingness to back up his many promises about supposedly being interested in peace by actually ending the killings. And we saw Melania Trump today with her letter about returning thousands, tens of thousands of Ukrainian children. That's a war crime that Russia has engaged in by deporting and abducting those children. And so I think the ceasefire is a minimal act of good faith that the Kremlin could show that it is actually interested in peace. Unfortunately, Trump has moved away from his harder stance, which I agreed with earlier. So when he was talking about immediate sanctions, if Russia did not immediately stop the bombing, when he talked about secondary sanctions, and when he talked about a ceasefire, I was completely in line with that. I think right now what we see is Zelenskyy and the European leaders and the NATO chief have had to pivot along with Trump because that's where the momentum and the attention is. But I think ultimately my hope is that today's meetings, that both Zelenskyy and the European leaders have been able to bring Trump back into a more commonsensical approach, an approach that recognizes that Russia is the aggressor.
Putin from day one has said we have to address the root causes of this conflict. What are the root causes from the Russian perspective?
Right. Well, you know, this is something I talk about with my students in the university. We read Putin's now notorious speech where he rewrites the history of Russia and Ukraine. His root cause is simply this, that Ukraine belongs to Russia, that Ukrainians are no different than Russians, that Ukraine is part of Russia, and he also blames the expansion of NATO or attributes the war to the expansion of NATO. Now, those factors are things we must consider, of course, but first of all, that historical understanding that he's touted in many interviews is wrong, it's false. Ask any Ukrainian or talk to any historian. And secondly, I think we have to recognize this, that what the root cause is really about Russia's revanchist and imperialist policies, which are really part and parcel of the way he's ruled for the last 25 years. I've been following Russia a long time, lived there, worked there, and this is very similar to the way he bombed Chechnya 25 years ago when he first became the president, and then in Syria, and then Ukraine in 2014, and in Georgia. So it's a long record of aggression.
So, Steve, can Ukraine accept any kind of deal that involves giving up land?
That is very difficult. Well, President Zelenskyy said the Constitution does not allow it. Of course, he's the president of a democratic country where he's simply doing what the Ukrainian people require of him, which is to defend the sovereignty of his country. So were Ukraine to recognize de jure the occupation of those 4 regions that Putin is asking for, including even areas that are not militarily occupied currently by Russian forces, I think that would be the death knell to his presidency. I think it would be really a tragedy. So I think what the European leaders and Zelenskyy have been pushing for is, in the event there's some sort of agreement here, it could not be de jure. It would have to be a de facto recognition of where the current line of the front line stands. But I believe that recognizing the occupation would only invite further Russian aggression in the future. So I don't think he's going to do that. I think he's going to find a way through this impasse.
And very quickly, do you believe all this pomp and ceremony at the White House with all the Europeans being here, talking, thanking President Trump, at the end of the day, will it make a difference? Will it bring peace between these 2 countries?
I think if we remember that this really is about civilians, if we remember the tens of thousands of prisoners of war that are stuck in Russia and how many have died, I think if we keep that forefront in our minds, and some part of President Trump, I have to give him credit for thinking about that humanitarian aspect, then I think there is a way through this. I think we will see some progress.
All right, Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you.